Thank you very much, Janet. If you're going to keep me strictly to 10 minutes, will you tell me when I've used up 9?
Yes, I will.
Because I'll need a minute to wind down.
Will do.
In any discussion about public education, it's important, first of all, to have a common understanding in the conversation about what it means to be a public school system. It's not a public school system because it's mandated by the School Act. Charter schools and private schools are mandated by the School Act. It's not a public school because it's publicly funded. Private schools and charter schools and homeschooling are all publicly funded. We have to go a little bit deeper for an understanding of what public school education is, and I'd like to offer you some thoughts about that this evening. The first is that public education exists to create and sustain a community. Now that's also the purpose of separate schools and charter schools and some, but not all, private schools. What distinguishes public schools on this matter of creating and sustaining a community is that public school education exists to create and sustain a peculiar kind of community, a civil democratic community. Public school education is the means by which we understand what we are as citizens of Morinville or citizens of Alberta or citizens of Canada. Public schools exist to create and sustain a particular kind of community, a civil democratic community. That's not the mandate of any other system. Separate schools, for example, don't exist to create and sustain a civil democratic community. They exist to create and sustain a faith community. Kevin Feehan, who is legal counsel for the Alberta Catholic School Trustees Association, wrote this in the fall of 2008, and I'm quoting Kevin. "Let Catholic education be separate, different, radical, and based upon a concept of education that is fundamentally opposed to that of the public school system." Kevin, of course, believes that his statement applies just as much to the Greater St. Albert Public School Division as it applies to the Edmonton Separate School District. For Kevin, the Catholicity of the Greater St. Albert Public School Division overrides the public nature of the system. A truly public school system exists to nurture kids in the understanding that they live and will live together, regardless of differences of race, religion, economic circumstances, intellect, or whatever. A separate school system exists to nurture kids in the understanding that they will live together as Catholics, somewhat apart from the rest of the world, because their common faith is the essential bond of their primary community, which is their faith community. That difference shows up in some very practical ways. A public school accepts little kids without precondition of any kind. A separate school accepts kids with very clear preconditions. You must be a member of the minority faith, or alternately, you must sign a form that says you accept the context of the minority faith. The differences show up in the classroom. In a public school, anything can be discussed. In a separate school, that is not the case. In a public school, as in a democracy, dissenting views and expressions are allowed, and they are challenged. In a separate school, there are clear limits to dissenting views, and those are the limits of the church, not of a democratic community. In a separate school, some ideas can't be raised, either to challenge or to be challenged. So public school education is completely inclusive as a matter of conviction and as a matter of right. Public school education is inclusive without preconditions of any kind. And lastly, public school education is neutral about the variety of institutional expressions of faith. Public school education does not favor one branch of Christianity over another, nor does it favor Christianity over another religion in the community. On the other hand, because the public school system does not promote one faith, it does not inferentially diminish the other faiths that it is not promoting. It doesn't disparage faith. This neutrality about religion is not a lack of respect for faith or disinterest in faith. It is based on the conviction that faith is personal to each and every one of us, and it would be wrong for the institutions of the state to bring their weight to bear in promoting one faith rather than another. It's probably important for me to point out as well that none of the cultural standards that oil the workings of our community are peculiar to Christianity. As well, none of them is vital to the core of Christianity. One does not need to be a Christian to understand that honesty is fundamentally important. And on the other hand, being honest is not the essential characteristic of a Christian. If one is interested in a theological justification for honesty, it can be found in the teachings of dozens of religions. In any case, regardless of religion, surely all of us expect honesty from our neighbors, no matter what their convictions are. Public schools have morals, teach values, and demand that each person be treated with respect. So what is the purpose of public school education? It's twofold. First of all, get to know the child and draw the fullness of the child out of the raw material. There's an old African adage that I would translate in this way: we're born as a peculiar kind of animal. We become human through our relationships, and it is both love and education that draws us into healthy relationships. Education is what makes us human. Education is what makes us members of this community. Education is what gives us the capacity to care about the future of this community and do the things that will ensure the survival and the thriving of the community for years to come. But the other equally important thing is to say that in that context, education is not only for the child, but it is also for the community. And education approaches this work with three vital understandings. First of all, public school education exists to be a deliberate model of a civil democratic community. Not a faith community, a civil democratic community. We must do what we say, we must practice what we preach, especially in front of our kids. Secondly, public school education is inclusive without preconditions of any kind. It's inclusive as a matter of conviction and by design. It's inclusive in the classroom, in the staff room, in the boardroom, and in the voting booth. It is inclusive as a matter of right, and it is also inclusive in that it is our responsibility as citizens to be inclusive of others when we go into our public school system. And the third vital understanding that public school education has is that it must be neutral about the variety of institutional expressions of faith. It draws its moral authority from the common work of all the great values, great religions and cultures, and it draws its moral authority from this community of which we are all a part. Consequently, it has great moral authority and does not need to rely on an institutional connection with one denomination or another for that moral authority. Thank you.